Member from Thunder Bay-Atikokan.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm pleased to have an opportunity this afternoon to speak to this piece of forest tenure legislation, Bill 151, and I apologize. I came in from Thunder Bay today. I have not heard much, if any, of what has been said up until this point regarding the debate on this piece of legislation. I wish I had been here earlier. It is, of course, a piece of legislation that is key and central to all of Northern Ontario, and as most people recognize, the impact of the forest industry also has a significant impact on the economies of areas beyond the jurisdictions of just Northern Ontario. I think I can probably assume, though, even though I have not heard much of the debate earlier, that there is at least some common denominators from, I would suspect, all three parties when it comes to issues related to forestry. And that is that what we have seen over the course of the last 10 years, I would say, and this transformation began long before we formed government, that I'm sure whether it's a Conservative speaking or an NDP speaking or a Liberal speaking, most people would likely agree that what's occurred in this industry is probably fair to be characterized as having been a very fundamental change. The forest industry in Northern Ontario was not adverse to seeing cyclical changes in the industry from decade to decade. That was normal. It's not like it happened every couple of years, but it wasn't unusual every 10 years or so to see changes in the fortunes of the forest industry. People somewhat got used to that. Some mills would prosper, others wouldn't do so well, but it was almost to be expected, and I think that was part of the problem, that we'd always come out of these cycles and that things would be as they were before, and that they would continue on the way they had in the past. I've lived in Thunder Bay almost my entire life, and I can tell you that that has pretty much been the history. And I think to some degree, all of us, and this predates our government, the NDP were in power in 90 to 95, and the Conservatives from 95 to 2003. We've now had the pleasure for the last 7 years. You could say we've all had some responsibility for managing or mismanaging the industry, because I think we all somehow felt that no matter what, the industry would always come back, that it would always stay the same. We'd cycle through another evolution of cyclical economic factors, many of them beyond our control, and at the end of it, we'd come out and there'd still be this many small sawmills scattered all across Northern Ontario. There'd always be a certain number of pulp and paper mills scattered across Northern Ontario. Well, we've learned this time that that's not the case. What occurred this time was not cyclical change. It was extremely fundamental in terms of the change that's occurred in the forest industry. And while I'm not a historian on the forest industry, I might argue that it's probably the first time that change of this magnitude has occurred in this industry. So what is it that we're going to do about that? Well, I've heard for 7 years, I've listened primarily, I will say, to the New Democratic Party blame the Liberal government for every sawmill closure and every pulp and paper mill closure in Northern Ontario. It was the fault of the Liberal government. That's what the NDP have said for 7 years. And I've said it to some of my other Northern members, you know, we didn't do a good enough job of speaking out against the ridiculous of that argument. We let them repeat the same thing over and over again, and I think there were a significant number of people in Northern Ontario that bought in and believed it. And they tied it primarily to the cost of power. They would suggest to everybody who had a job in a sawmill or a pulp and paper mill that closed, sometimes permanently, that the reason that happened was because the Liberal government in the province of Ontario wasn't doing a good enough job when it came to controlling power rates. That's what the NDP did. In fact, I need to give the Conservatives some credit, because they didn't buy into that line of ridiculousness at the beginning. But I would say...
Member from Durham on a point of order.
Ask the member to repeat that statement there.
From Thunder Bay-Atikokan.
He might not want me to repeat it when I finish the comment, but I would say that lately the Conservatives seem to be, as the election date nears, starting to trot out that old familiar NDP line a little bit more. Speaker, I want to talk just a bit about the electricity piece of this. When it comes, you have to divide the forestry industry into at least two pieces, pulp and paper side and the sawmilling side. And the suggestion by, again, primarily the NDP, that somehow electricity rates had anything to do with the demise of the sawmilling half of the forestry industry is incredible. Electricity is not a significant input cost when it comes to sawmills in Northern Ontario, or, without knowing for sure, I could probably say almost any other jurisdiction in Canada. It just is not. Excuse me. And so out of the tens of thousands of jobs that the NDP like to talk about being lost in the forestry industry, a lot of those jobs were in the sawmilling industry. And I can tell you unequivocally that the connection between electricity pricing and sawmill jobs is simply misplaced. It's absurd. It's unfair. And I've said in this legislature before that when NDP members would stand in their place and tell people back in Thunder Bay and Atikokan and all across Northern Ontario that if we just fix those energy prices, don't worry, you'll get your job back. People were making life decisions. Do I need to move? Do I need to go back to school? Do I need to get retrained? They were really doing a disservice to all of those people, because what had occurred in this industry was a fundamental shift that could not be fixed by simply lowering the cost of energy by 1 megawatt or whatever the price may be. It was an absurd argument to make, but they continued to make it and people bought into it. And they might have decided, I'm going to stay in my home, or I'm not going to go out and try and get a job in the oil patch, or I'm not going to go back to school and get retrained in a second career program put forward by our government. It was a terrible thing to do. You did a disservice to people who were caught up in this economic storm, this perfect storm that affected the forest industry as it was described. You were doing those people a disservice because they needed to make life choices. They had a very hard decision. Many of those people are my friends that I went through school with. I know the demographic very well. Many of them had grade 10, grade 12 education. They were 25, 30-year employees of these particular industries and mills. They had a tough choice to make, and the suggestion was made, don't worry, all we have to do is lower the cost of electricity. It was a nonsensical argument to make, but some people believed it. You know what? There's no market for the products that sawmills produce. There's still some sawmills operating, and I think, my personal opinion, that when we come out of it, there always are going to be sawmills, there's always going to be pulp and paper mills. And there are still some sawmills operating, but they're going to be bigger. And to compete from this point forward, they're going to have to be bigger in order to compete. That's my belief. But the fact of the matter is, Madam Speaker, when it comes to the products that they produce, the market was greatly diminished, almost to the point of being wiped out. The Buchanan sawmills in my neck of the woods that employed thousands of people for a very long time, for decades, 90 to 95% of his product was exported into the American market. 90 to 95% of it. Well, guess what's gone on in the American market for the last 7 or 10 years? There's this thing called the greatest recession since the Great Depression. There's this thing called the subprime mortgage problem, where this incredible glut of houses appeared on the American market, and you could go down there and buy a $400,000 house for $50,000. And so guess what that meant to the housing market? Nobody's building houses. Ipso facto, Buchanan sawmills, 95% of his product that went into the U.S., he doesn't have a customer anymore. But the NDP would tell those workers, don't go back to school, don't get retrained, don't go get a job in another jurisdiction, because we're going to just fix this with the cost of electricity.